A long time ago, in the village of Oyarifa, nestled at the foot of a mountain in Ghana, there lived a young woman named Abina. Everyone in the village knew her. She was strikingly beautiful, with bright, piercing eyes and smooth, dark skin that glistened in the sun. When people saw her, they would stop and stare in admiration of her beauty. But there was something else about Abina that made people cautious. Abina was feared by the men in Oyarifa. They knew to stay away from her. She did not laugh with anyone, nor did she smile, and any man who dared to approach her faced the same fate. He would leave bruised and beaten. The men whispered among themselves in fear of Abina. They shared stories of those who had tried to win her heart, only to be met with fists instead of affection. One evening, Abina sat quietly in front of her hut, braiding her long, thick hair. The sun had just begun to set, casting golden light over the village. As she worked, a young man, Kofi, walked by, his chest puffed out with pride. Kofi had heard the stories of Abina, but he believed he was different. "I will be the one to make her smile," he said to himself. Kofi approached Abina confidently, offering her a basket of fruit as a gift. "Abina," he said, trying to sound charming, "I have brought you the sweetest fruits in all of Oyarifa. Please, accept them." But Abina did not even look up from her hair. She continued to braid in silence. Kofi, undeterred, moved closer, reaching out to touch her arm. And in an instant, her hand shot out, striking him hard across the face. The sound echoed through the village like thunder. Kofi staggered backward, his cheek burning from the slap, and without a word, he turned and fled. The villagers who witnessed the scene whispered among themselves. "Abina has done it again," they said, shaking their heads. "She is not like the other women." Days turned into weeks, and still, men tried to win Abina over. One after another, they came, bringing gifts, saying sweet words, hoping to soften her heart. But every time, the result was the same. Abina would fight them off with a strength that left them limping home, battered and humiliated. The men of Oyarifa learned that no matter who they were or what they offered, Abina would not let them close without a fight. The village elders grew concerned. "Why does she behave this way?" they asked one another. "What has made her so angry?" One day, they decided to confront Abina. They called her to the village square, where all could see. The villagers gathered, curious to see what would happen. Abina walked into the square, her head held high, her eyes scanning the crowd with a look of defiance. The elders, sitting in a circle, waited for her to speak. "Abina," one elder began, his voice soft but firm, "why do you fight the men who come to you? Why do you beat every suitor that tries to win your heart?" Abina stood silently, her face expressionless. The crowd waited, holding their breath. Finally, after a long pause, she spoke, her voice calm and steady. "I will never let a man control me," she said, her words ringing out clear and strong. "And I will never stop fighting." Her response shocked the crowd. They had expected excuses, perhaps a story of mischief or stubbornness. But Abina's words were filled with conviction and pain. The elders exchanged glances, unsure of how to proceed. "But why, Abina?" another elder asked, his voice pleading. "What has happened to make you feel this way?" Abina did not answer. She stood there, tall and unafraid, refusing to explain herself further. The elders were left with no choice but to let her go, more confused than ever. The villagers returned to their homes, whispering to one another about Abina's strange behavior, but no one dared to challenge her. One hot afternoon, Abina went to the stream to fetch water. The sun was high in the sky, and the path was rough beneath her feet. As she walked back to the village, balancing the pot of water on her head, she slipped on a loose stone and fell hard to the ground. The pot shattered, spilling water everywhere, and Abina winced in pain as she tried to stand. A farmer, who had been working nearby, saw what had happened and rushed over to help. "Let me tie your injured foot," he said kindly, bending down to assist her. But Abina, in her pain and confusion, did not understand his intentions. She thought he was trying to take advantage of her vulnerability. Without a second thought, she struck him hard across the face. "Don't you dare touch me," she shouted, her voice filled with fury. The farmer, holding his swollen face, tried to explain, "I was only trying to help." But Abina would not listen. She was too angry, too lost in her rage. The farmer, knowing better than to argue, picked himself up and limped away. The story of Abina's attack on the farmer spread quickly through the village. She beat a man who was only trying to help her, the people whispered. But no one confronted Abina. They were all too afraid. Despite her fierce reputation, Abina's beauty caught the attention of Kwame, the son of the village chief. Kwame had heard the stories of her strength and temper, but he was intrigued by her independence. There is no other woman like her in all of Oyarifa, he thought. Kwame believed he could win her over. He began visiting Abina, bringing her gifts, fine cloths, golden beads, and the juiciest fruits from the market. Abina accepted his gifts, but she remained distant, her eyes always watching him with caution. The villagers were amazed. Perhaps Kwame will be the one to tame her, they whispered. But Abina was not so easily won over. One day, Kwame invited Abina to walk with him by the river. The air was cool, and the water flowed gently as they strolled side by side. Kwame, feeling confident that he had earned her trust, reached out to take her hand. But the moment his fingers touched her skin, Abina's anger flared. To her, this was not a gesture of affection, it was an attempt to control her. Without warning, she struck him. First in the chest, then in the face. Kwame stumbled backward, stunned by her strength. He tried to defend himself, but Abina was too fast, too powerful. By the time she was done, Kwame was lying on the ground, bruised and bleeding. His guards, who had been standing nearby, rushed to his aid. They carried Kwame back to the village, his face swollen, his body aching. The news of Abina's attack on Kwame spread through Oyarifa like wildfire. She beat the chief's son. The villagers gasped in disbelief. No one had ever dared to lay a hand on him. When Kwame returned to the palace, his father, Chief Utter, was furious. "Who would dare do this to my son?" he roared. The servants trembled, but they all knew it was Abina. Chief Utter summoned Abina to the palace. Word spread quickly, and soon the entire village had gathered at the palace courtyard to see what would happen. When Abina arrived, she walked into the courtyard with her head held high, her face unflinching. The people watched her in silence, wondering if she would finally show fear. But Abina stood tall, her eyes cold and unafraid. Chief Utter, sitting on his high throne, glared down at her. "Why did you attack my son?" he demanded, his voice booming. Abina remained silent. The crowd leaned in, eager to hear her answer, but still, she said nothing. The chief's anger grew. "Speak, girl. Why did you do it?" Abina's heart pounded in her chest, but she would not be bullied. For a long moment, she stood there in silence, until finally, her expression softened. Tears welled in her eyes, and her voice trembled as she began to speak. Chief Utter leaned forward in his seat, eyes still blazing with fury. The villagers stood in silence, holding their breath, waiting to hear what Abina would say next. They had always known her to be strong and fearless, but now, as they watched her tears fall, they began to realize there was more to her story than they had ever imagined. "My father," Abina began, her voice cracking, "was not a kind man. He was cruel and harsh." She paused, wiping her tears with the back of her hand. The villagers leaned in closer, eager to hear her tale, one they had never heard before. "My mother was a gentle woman," Abina continued, her eyes distant, as though she were recalling memories she had long tried to forget. "She did everything to please him, to care for him. But no matter what she did, he would raise his hand against her. He beat her, day after day, until her body was bruised and broken. I watched it all, helpless." The crowd gasped. They had never imagined that someone as fierce and untouchable as Abina had suffered so much as a child. The village women, in particular, exchanged glances of sympathy, understanding her pain in a way the men could not. Abina's voice grew stronger as she continued. "One day, when my mother was pregnant with my younger brother, there was an argument. Something small, so small that I can barely remember what it was about. But my father, he lost his temper." Her hands trembled, and the villagers could see the raw emotion etched into every word she spoke. "He beat her so badly that she fell to the ground, and she lost the baby." Tears were streaming down Abina's face now, but she did not stop speaking. "My mother never recovered from that day. She died soon after. And Abina paused, taking a deep breath, "I was left alone. alone with the memories of her suffering. The villagers were silent, their hearts heavy with sorrow for the young girl who had endured so much pain. Chief Utter shifted uncomfortably on his throne, his anger slowly giving way to a deep sense of regret. He had summoned Abena to punish her for hurting his son, but now he realized that her rage came from a place of unimaginable pain. Abena's story did not end with her father's death. After her mother passed away, she was sent to live with her uncles, her father's brothers. But life with them was no better. I thought I would find peace in their home, Abena said, her voice low. But instead, I found more cruelty. Her eyes darkened as she spoke of the men who had taken her in. My uncles were just like my father. They treated the women in their lives like property, shouting at them, belittling them, and forcing themselves on them whenever they wanted. I watched them treat their wives and other women with no respect, and I knew that I would never allow myself to be treated that way. The village women began to murmur among themselves, their faces reflecting both anger and understanding. They, too, had seen the way men in the village sometimes treated women. They knew the fear that Abena had lived with, and they understood why she had become so fiercely protective of herself. I swore, Abena said, her voice growing stronger again, that I would never let any man control me. Never let any man touch me without my permission. And so, I fought. I fought every man who tried to get close, every man who thought he could tame me or use me the way my uncles and my father had used the women in their lives. The villagers listened in awe. They had always seen Abena as a troublemaker, a wild girl who fought for no reason. But now they understood. She was not fighting just for herself, but for every woman who had been beaten, belittled, and controlled by the men in their lives. The prince, Kwame, stood nearby, his face still bruised from the beating Abena had given him. As he listened to her story, his heart sank. He had thought, like so many others, that he could win her over with gifts and charm. He had thought that if he treated her kindly, she would soften. But now he realized that he had misunderstood her completely. He stepped forward, his voice quiet but sincere. Abena, he said, I did not know. I thought I could change you, make you see that not all men are like your father or your uncles. But I see now that I was wrong. I apologize. Abena looked at him, her eyes still wet with tears, but her expression softened slightly. She had never heard a man apologize to her before, not her father, not her uncles, not any of the men who had tried to win her over. Kwame continued, I promise, from this day forward, to respect your strength. I will never try to control you, and I will never hurt you. The crowd murmured in surprise. Could it be true? Could the prince, the son of the most powerful man in Oyarifa, really be admitting his mistake and asking for forgiveness? Chief Utter, too, was stunned. He had raised his son to be proud and strong, to never admit weakness. But now, as he looked at Kwame, he realized that true strength did not come from force or control. It came from understanding, from empathy, from respect. Days passed after Abena's revelation, and the village was abuzz with conversation. The villagers had always feared Abena, but now they saw her in a new light. They understood her pain, and many of the women began to admire her for her strength, for standing up against the men who had tried to control her. Kwame, true to his word, continued to visit Abena, but this time he did not bring gifts or try to charm her. Instead, he spoke to her as an equal, listening to her stories, respecting her boundaries, and learning from her strength. Slowly, Abena began to let her guard down. She still did not trust easily, but she could see that Kwame was different. He did not try to overpower her, did not try to win her over with empty promises. Instead, he offered her something she had never had before, respect. One evening, as the sun set over Oyarifa, casting a warm golden glow over the village, Kwame stood before Abena's hut. Abena, he said quietly, I do not ask for your love or your hand, but I ask for your friendship. I ask to stand beside you, as an equal. Abena looked at him for a long moment, her heart pounding. She had never imagined that a man could speak to her in this way, without expectation or demand. Slowly, she nodded. I accept your friendship, Kwame. But know this, I will never be controlled by any man. Kwame smiled, a genuine, warm smile that Abena had never seen from him before. I would not have it any other way, he said. The friendship between Abena and Kwame grew, and with it, the village of Oyarifa began to change. The men, who had once seen women as possessions, began to see them as equals, as partners. The women, inspired by Abina's courage, began to speak up more, to stand up for themselves, to demand respect. Abina's story spread throughout the village and beyond, becoming a legend told around fires at night. Mothers told their daughters about the fierce girl who had refused to be broken, and fathers told their sons about the prince who had learned the true meaning of strength. And so, the village of Oyarifa grew not only in size but in spirit. It became a place where men and women stood side by side, where strength was measured not by power or control, but by respect and understanding. Years passed, and Abina's name became known far and wide. She and Kwame continued their friendship, and though they never married, they remained close companions, each respecting the other's independence and strength. Abina became a symbol of resilience, not only in Oyarifa but in the villages beyond. A story was told to girls and women who had been silenced for too long, giving them the courage to stand up for themselves, to refuse to be controlled or beaten down. And as the years went on, Abina grew old, but her spirit never dimmed. She remained the fierce girl who had fought for her own freedom, and in doing so, had changed her village forever. Life in Oyarifa began to shift, though not without resistance. Many of the men in the village struggled to accept the new reality. They had grown up in a world where men led, where men made decisions and women followed. But Abina's courage had shaken that order, and for the first time, the men found themselves questioning what they had once believed to be their birthright. There was one man in particular, Kofi, a well-respected farmer, who was known for being stern but fair. He had 2 daughters, and had always treated them with kindness, though his wife, Emma, was another story. Emma had long suffered under Kofi's control, as he believed that discipline was necessary for keeping a household in order. But after hearing Abina's story in the village square, Emma began to change. She no longer lowered her eyes when Kofi raised his voice. She started speaking up, questioning him when he made decisions that affected her and their children. Kofi noticed this change and grew uncomfortable. One evening, Kofi returned home from the fields to find Emma sitting outside their home, her hands busily weaving a mat. Her daughters were playing nearby, giggling as they chased one another through the courtyard. Kofi sat beside her, feeling the weight of the day's work on his shoulders. "You seem different lately," he said, his voice casual but laced with suspicion. Emma looked up at him, her hands stilling for a moment. "I'm just tired of being quiet," she replied simply. Kofi frowned. "You've never had a problem with how things were before. Why now?" Emma met his gaze, her eyes steady. "Because I've realized I'm more than just your wife, Kofi. I am a person with my own thoughts, my own desires, and I want to live without fear of your temper." Kofi was taken aback by her words. For years, he had never considered what Emma might be feeling, assuming that as long as he provided for his family, everything else would fall into place. But now, confronted with her quiet defiance, he found himself uncertain. "Who's been putting these ideas in your head?" he asked, his tone sharp. Emma didn't flinch. "No one put them there. I've always had them. But it's Abina who reminded me that it's okay to speak up." Kofi stood abruptly, his jaw clenched. He had always respected Abina's strength, but hearing her name mentioned in his own home felt like an intrusion. "That girl, she's turning this village upside down. Nothing will be the same if women start thinking they can." "Thinking they can what?" Emma interrupted, standing as well. "Be treated as equals? Be respected? Don't I deserve that?" Kofi stared at his wife, speechless. He had never heard her speak this way before. The silence between them stretched long into the evening, but something in Kofi began to shift. He couldn't deny that Emma had a point. He had taken her for granted, assumed her role in the household without ever asking what she wanted. For the first time, Kofi began to question the way things had always been. Emma's newfound courage didn't go unnoticed by the other women in Oyarifa. Slowly, conversations began to emerge among them. At the well, while fetching water, the women would gather and whisper about Abina's strength and her defiance of the village's traditions. Some of them had long been living under the shadow of their husband's dominance, never daring to speak out. Akwisa's wife, Efua, was one of those women. She had always been quiet, dutifully following her husband's lead in every aspect of their lives. But as she watched Amma, and heard the other women talking about Abina, something inside her began to stir. One morning, while preparing breakfast, Efua approached her husband. "Akwisi," she said, her voice tentative but firm, "I want to talk to you." Akwisi, sitting at the table waiting for his meal, looked up, surprised. "What is it, Efua?" he asked, not used to his wife initiating conversations. "I've been thinking a lot about Abina and what she said in the square," Efua began, her hands fidgeting nervously, "about how women deserve to have their voices heard. And I realized that I've been silent for too long." Akwisi raised an eyebrow. "Silent? You've always spoken when needed." "That's just it," Efua replied, her voice growing stronger. "I only speak when you think it's needed. But I have thoughts and feelings that I've kept to myself because I didn't think they mattered." Akwisi stared at her, his mouth slightly open in surprise. This wasn't the Efua he had known for all these years. She had always been quiet, content with her role. He wasn't sure how to respond. "I'm not saying I want to change everything," Efua continued, sensing his discomfort. "But I want you to know that I have a voice too. And I want to use it." Akwisi was silent for a long time, absorbing his wife's words. Like many men in Oyarifa, he had never questioned the traditional roles they had been born into. But hearing Efua speak up, seeing the determination in her eyes, he couldn't help but wonder if there was truth in what Abina had said. While the women of Oyarifa found strength in Abina's example, Kwame embarked on his own journey of reflection. His encounter with Abina had changed him deeply, forcing him to confront the privileges he had never questioned as the Prince of Oyarifa. As the days passed, Kwame couldn't stop thinking about the lessons he had learned from Abina. He had always believed that being a leader meant showing strength through dominance and control. But Abina's strength was different. It came from a place of resilience, born of suffering and a refusal to be broken. One afternoon, Kwame sat alone by the stream where he had once walked with Abina. The memory of that day still haunted him, how he had reached out to hold her hand, believing it was a simple gesture, only for her to respond with fury. He hadn't understood it then, but now, after hearing her story, he realized how much pain his action had caused her. As Kwame gazed into the water, his reflection staring back at him, he began to question the very foundation of his beliefs. What did it mean to be a leader? Could he truly lead his people if he didn't understand their struggles, if he didn't respect their boundaries? For the first time in his life, Kwame felt vulnerable. He had always been taught that vulnerability was a weakness, something to be avoided at all costs. But now he saw that vulnerability could also be a source of strength. It allowed him to connect with others, to understand their pain and their needs. Kwame rose from his spot by the stream, his heart heavy but determined. He knew he had a long way to go, but he was willing to change. He would become the kind of leader who led with empathy, not force. And he would honor the strength of women like Abina, not as something to be tamed, but as something to be celebrated. As the village of Oyarifa continued to transform, the elders decided to hold a festival in honor of the changing times. The Festival of Strength, as it was called, would celebrate not just physical strength, but the strength of character, resilience, and courage. It would be a time for both men and women to come together as equals, to honor the progress they had made and to look forward to a future of mutual respect. The day of the festival arrived, and the village square was alive with activity. Stalls were set up with food and crafts, children ran through the streets laughing, and the air was filled with music and the scent of roasting meat. At the center of the square, a stage had been built for the evening's events. There would be storytelling, dancing, and speeches from the village's leaders. But the most anticipated event of the day was the recognition of Abina, the girl whose courage had sparked the change. As the sun began to set, casting a golden glow over the village, the crowd gathered in front of the stage. Kwame stood at the podium, his heart pounding with nervous excitement. He had been chosen to speak on behalf of the village, to honor Abina and the women of Oyarifa for their strength and resilience. Kwame took a deep breath and began to speak. Today, we come together not just to celebrate strength in its physical form, but the strength that comes from within, the strength to speak up when we are silenced, to stand tall when we are beaten down, to demand respect when it is denied. As Kwame finished his speech, the crowd erupted in applause. But their attention soon turned to Abina, who had been standing quietly at the edge of the stage, watching the proceedings unfold with humility. Kwame extended a hand toward her, motioning for her to join him on the platform. Abina hesitated for a moment, her heart pounding. This was not a place she ever imagined herself, a place of honor, a place of recognition. But she knew that the women of Oyarifa were looking at her with hope in their eyes, and she could not let them down. With slow, deliberate steps, Abina walked onto the stage. The crowd grew silent as she stood before them. Her journey had been long and filled with pain, but now, standing in front of her village, she realized that a fight had never been just for herself. It had always been for every woman, every girl, and every person who had ever been silenced. She took a deep breath, and then she spoke. I am not a leader. I am not someone who wanted to stand here, in front of you all. But life has brought me to this place, and I know that what I have done has opened a door for others to walk through. The crowd watched her, hanging on every word. Many of you know my story. You know the pain I have endured, the battles I have fought. But I am not the only one. Each of you, in your own way, has fought your own battles, whether they are seen or unseen. And today, we honor that strength. She paused, looking out into the sea of faces. She saw Emma standing beside Kofi, who had taken her hand gently in his. She saw Efua, standing a little taller than before, and Akwisi beside her, his expression one of quiet respect. The women of Oyarifa were not just spectators anymore. They were rising. But strength, Abina continued, is not something that belongs to any one of us. It is something we share. It is something that grows when we lift each other up, when we listen, when we respect each other. Kwame stepped forward to stand beside her, his presence offering silent support. We are stronger together, he said softly, his voice carrying over the crowd. For a moment, the village was still. Then, from the back of the crowd, a voice called out. To Abina. It was Emma, her voice ringing with pride. To Abina, the crowd echoed, their voices a chorus of gratitude and celebration. And as they cheered, Abina felt the weight of her journey begin to lift. She was no longer alone. The sun had dipped below the horizon, and the village square was bathed in the soft light of lanterns strung between the trees. The mood was jubilant, the festival in full swing. People danced to the rhythmic beat of the drums, their feet moving in time with the music. But this was not just any dance. This was a dance of unity. For the first time, men and women danced together, not in separate circles, but as equals. The lines that had once divided them had begun to blur, and in their place was a sense of togetherness that Oyarifa had never seen before. Kwame and Abina stood at the edge of the square, watching the dancers with quiet smiles. I never imagined the village could change this much, Kwame said, his voice full of wonder. It's like a new beginning. Abina nodded, but her expression was thoughtful. Change is never easy. There will still be those who resist, who hold on to the old ways. But tonight is a step forward. Kwame turned to her, his eyes searching her face. And what about us? Where do we go from here? Abina met his gaze, her heart fluttering. There was something different in Kwame now, something softer, more open. He had been changed by her story, just as she had been changed by his willingness to listen. I think, Abina said slowly, that we will find our way. But it will take time. Kwame smiled, a quiet understanding passing between them. He reached out, hesitating for a moment, and then gently took her hand. This time, Abina didn't pull away. Despite the joy of the festival, the transformation of Oyarifa was not without its challenges. There were still men in the village who grumbled about the changes, who whispered in dark corners that things were moving too fast. Among them was Adu, an elder who had long held onto the old ways. Adu was known for his stubbornness, for his belief that the traditions of their ancestors were sacred and should not be questioned. He had watched the events of the festival with a frown, his arms crossed over his chest. This is not the way things are meant to be, he muttered to his friend, Nana, as they sat by the fire. Men and women, dancing together like this. It's unnatural. Nana, who had been quiet for most of the evening, looked at his friend with a thoughtful expression. I used to think that too, he said slowly. But maybe it's time we start thinking differently. Adu scowled. What are you saying, Nana? That we should just throw away everything our fathers and grandfathers taught us? No, Nana replied, shaking his head. But maybe there's room to grow. Our fathers and grandfathers lived in a different time. The world is changing, and maybe we need to change with it. Adu fell silent, his mind wrestling with the idea. He had never considered that change could be a part of tradition, that holding on to the past didn't mean rejecting the future. But as he watched the younger generation dancing and laughing together, he began to wonder if perhaps Nana was right. While many in the village were embracing the new changes, not everyone was ready to accept them. There were whispers of quiet resistance among some of the men, who felt threatened by the newfound empowerment of the women. In the dimly lit back room of one of the village huts, a small group of men gathered. They spoke in low voices, their faces grim. "This can't go on," one of them said, his voice harsh. "If we let this continue, the women will think they can do anything. We'll lose control." The others murmured in agreement. They had watched as their wives and daughters began to speak up, as the women of the village gained confidence. It made them uncomfortable, afraid that they were losing their power. But among them was one man who had begun to see things differently. His name was Kojo, and though he had come to the meeting out of loyalty to his friends, he found himself questioning their words. His own wife, Akua, had been among those who had found her voice, and Kojo couldn't deny that their relationship had improved because of it. "Maybe we shouldn't see this as a threat," Kojo said cautiously. "Maybe it's an opportunity." The other men turned to him, their expressions skeptical. "An opportunity for what?" one of them asked, his tone mocking. "An opportunity to be better," Kojo replied, his voice growing stronger. "To be better husbands, better fathers, better men." The room fell silent, Kojo's words hanging in the air. It was a bold statement, one that challenged everything they had been taught. But in the quiet that followed, some of the men began to wonder if perhaps he was right. As the festival faded and the village returned to its daily rhythm, the women of Oyarifa began to gather regularly at Abina's home. It was Emma's idea, her voice a little shy when she suggested it. "We need a place to talk, to share. What if we meet once a week?" she had asked Abina, her eyes hopeful. Abina was taken aback by the request. She had never imagined herself as a leader of women, but Emma's suggestion made sense. For so long, the women of Oyarifa had been silenced, their fears and dreams kept to themselves. They needed a space to be heard. And so, the women's circle was born. Every Thursday, the women gathered in Abina's courtyard. Some came with their babies strapped to their backs, others with baskets of food to share. They sat in a circle on the ground, their voices soft at first, but growing stronger as the weeks went on. The first meeting was awkward. The women sat quietly, unsure of what to say or how to begin. But it was Efua who broke the silence. Her voice was hesitant at first, but she spoke about the small changes she had noticed in her own life since the festival, how Akwisa had begun helping with the children, how he listened to her more. It was a small thing, but to her, it was everything. From that point on, the floodgates opened. The women shared their stories of love and loss, of hope and fear. They spoke of their challenges as wives and mothers, as daughters and sisters. And as they shared, they realized they were not alone. Emma, who had once been so quiet, found her voice in the circle. "I used to think I was the only one," she said one evening, her hands trembling slightly as she spoke. "But now I see, we are all carrying the same burdens." Abina sat at the center of the circle, listening intently. She didn't speak often, but when she did, her words carried weight. "We have been taught to endure," she said one evening, her voice steady. "But now, we must learn to thrive." As the women found strength in each other, the men of Oyarifa began to notice the changes in their wives and daughters. Some, like Akwisi, embraced the shift, realizing that their relationships had improved because of it. But others, like Adu, clung tightly to the old ways. Kwame found himself caught between two worlds. As the village chief, he had always been a man of tradition, a leader who upheld the customs passed down from generation to generation. But Abina had opened his eyes to a different way of thinking, a way that valued equality and respect. One afternoon, as Kwame sat in his courtyard, Adu approached him, his face tight with frustration. "Kwame," he began, his voice low. "The village is changing too quickly. The women, they are becoming too bold. This cannot continue." Kwame listened patiently, his brow furrowed in thought. Adu, I hear your concerns. But what would you have me do? Should we silence them again, after all they have endured? Adu's jaw clenched. Our fathers did not teach us to let women lead. It is not our way. Kwame sighed, his gaze shifting to the horizon. He had always respected Adu, a man of wisdom and experience, but now, for the first time, he felt the weight of disagreement between them. Our fathers did not live in these times, Kwame said finally. The world is changing, Adu, and we must change with it. If we do not, we risk losing the respect of those we are meant to protect. Adu shook his head, his expression hard. You are letting that woman, Abina, cloud your judgment. Kwame stood, his eyes flashing with a quiet intensity. Abina has shown us the strength of a woman's heart. If you cannot see that, Adu, then it is you who are blinded. Despite Kwame's resolve, doubt began to creep into the minds of some of the villagers. The changes in Oyarifa were happening so quickly, and not everyone was ready to embrace them. Whispers of rebellion began to spread. In the shadows of the marketplace, small groups of men gathered, their voices hushed but filled with anger. This is not our way, one man hissed, his face twisted in frustration. The women are getting too powerful. Soon, they will forget their place. Another man, slightly older, nodded in agreement. We need to remind them who is in charge. Kojo, who had once been part of these secret meetings, now found himself standing at a crossroads. His heart was torn between loyalty to his friends and the new understanding he had found with his wife, Akua. He had seen firsthand how much happier she was since the festival, how much more peace there was in their home. But the pressure from the men was intense. They looked to him for leadership, for guidance. And Kojo knew that if he did not stand with them, he would be seen as a traitor. That night, as Kojo sat by the fire with Akua, his thoughts weighed heavily on him. Akua, sensing his unease, placed a gentle hand on his arm. What is troubling you? She asked softly. Kojo hesitated, unsure of how to explain the conflict within him. The men, they are unhappy with the changes. They think the women are becoming too bold, too strong. Akua's brow furrowed in concern. And what do you think? Kojo looked into his wife's eyes, seeing the quiet strength there. I think, he paused, choosing his words carefully. I think that strength is not something we should fear. Akua smiled, a small, soft smile that spoke volumes. Then follow your heart, Kojo. Do what you know is right. As tensions rose in the village, the Council of Elders was called to a meeting. It was a rare occurrence, reserved only for the most serious matters. The elders sat in a circle beneath the old baobab tree, their faces lined with age and wisdom. Kwame stood before them, his expression calm but resolute. He had called the meeting, knowing that the future of Oyarifa hung in the balance. We are at a crossroads, Kwame began, his voice steady. The women of this village have found their voices, and some among us are afraid of what this means. But I believe that this is an opportunity, for all of us. The elders listened in silence, their eyes fixed on the young chief. Among them was Nana, who had been one of the first to support Kwame's decision to allow the Festival of Unity. But there were others, like Adu, who were less convinced. Adu spoke first, his voice laced with frustration. Kwame, you speak of opportunity, but all I see is division. The men are unhappy, and the women are becoming too bold. This cannot continue. Kwame nodded, acknowledging Adu's concerns. I understand your fears, Adu, but I believe that we must move forward, not backward. The women of Oyarifa have endured much, and it is time for us to stand beside them, not above them. The elders murmured among themselves, their expressions thoughtful. Finally, Nana spoke, his voice calm and measured. Kwame is right. We cannot hold onto the past forever. The world is changing, and we must change with it. If we do not, we will be left behind. Adu's face tightened, but he said nothing more. The decision had been made, and he knew that the tide of change could not be stopped. As the days passed, the tension in Oyarifa grew. The men who had resisted the changes became more vocal, their anger simmering beneath the surface. And then, one fateful night, the storm finally broke. It was a dark, moonless night when the village was awakened by the sound of shouting. A group of men, led by Adu, had gathered in the village square, their faces twisted with rage. "This has gone too far," Adu shouted, his voice echoing through the night. "We will not be controlled by women." The crowd of men cheered, their voices filled with anger and frustration. They began to march toward Abina's home, torches in hand, their intentions clear. But they were not the only ones awake that night. Abina, sensing the unrest, had gathered the women in her courtyard. They stood together, a silent wall of strength, ready to face whatever came their way. When Adu and his followers arrived, they were met with an unexpected sight. The women stood in a line, their faces calm but resolute. Abina stood at the front, her eyes steady as she faced Adu. "This is not the way," Abina said, her voice clear and strong. "We are not your enemies." Adu sneered, his grip tightening on his torch. "You have taken everything from us. Our pride, our power. You think you can rule this village? You are wrong." Abina's gaze didn't waver. "We do not seek to rule. We seek to live as equals."